Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on BCBS-IOSCO compliance. Where are we now, and what are the next steps? My name is Strath Lanyon. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'll just say a few quick words about myself and also some logistics. So I'm the Director of Professional Services for Asia Pacific at Calypso here, where I lead a regional team of approximately 70 consultants, and we run global deployments and also upgrade projects across a number of financial institutions in the sell side, buy side, and also within the CCPs. A couple of logistics before we get started here today. So we are recording this session, and all attendees are currently muted to avoid any background noise. We will leave time for questions at the end of today's webinar. But please, feel free to submit your questions at any point during the session by using the question windows in your sidebar. And if you face any technical issues during the webinar, you can type your question on the chat window and we'll see that as well. Or alternatively, you can also email marketing@calypso.com. Okay, so let's kick things off by looking at today's agenda. Okay, so before 2008, just stepping back a bit, only ETD transactions were really subject to initial margin. And as we all know, after the global financial crisis, with the OTC clearing mandates coming in, initial margin then expanded into the OTC cleared transactions. Moving from there, since September 2016, initial margin has also been required for their now non-cleared OTC trades under BCBS 317. Progressively, all financial institutions will be subject to initial margin for all derivative transactions. And I guess what this will mean really is that banks are going to be faced with both operational and organisational challenges as they need to comply with the new IM regulations. So in today's webinar, we're going to cover the following topics. We're going to have a look at the regulatory background in terms of what regulations should firms comply with. We'll have a look at the IM phasing and where we're at. We'll have a dig into what is ISDA-SIM. Also have a look at what we need to do in terms of getting ready for IM regulatory requirements, and have a look at next steps as well. Okay, panelists. So to discuss all these topics here today, we do have a strong lineup of panelists. Firstly, we have Rahul Advani. Rahul is the Director of Public Policy at ISDA, and he focuses on regulatory advocacy for Southeast Asia. He's actually based out of Singapore. Rahul's main areas of focus are regulations on central counterparty clearing, margin for non-centrally cleared derivatives, and the Basel III capital framework. Welcome, Rahul. It's great to have you speaking in this webinar. We also have another speaker from ISDA, Nnamdi Okemi. Nnamdi is a director within the Risk and Capital Group at ISDA, where he specifically focuses on managing the process for the further enhancement, testing, collaboration and validation of SIM to ensure that SIM is compliant with the regulations and also suitable for the market need. So good morning, Nnamdi, as well, and thank you again for joining the panel today. Lastly, we have Sophie Magnier-Foy, Global Principal Product Manager for Margin Clearing and Risk of Calypso Technology. So in Sophie's role, she designs the Calypso margin solutions to meet the various regulatory margin and clearing requirements. Currently, Sophie works very closely with the clients implementing ISDA-SIM to ensure that their IOSCO BCBS compliance for September 2018, 2019, and 2020 will be successful. Ms. Magnier-Foy is also in charge of the Margin Services Cloud Initiative at Calypso, which is offering native cloud microservices. The first service is offering ISDA-SIM margin calculation and management as well. So I'd like to start the discussion today and looking into the regulatory background of BCBS-IOSCO. So let's start with yourself, Rahul. There's several local regulations and regulatory IM thresholds that we face. What's the best way for firms to know if they are in scope for Reg IM? When they're due and for which jurisdictions?
Thank you for the introduction, Strat, and also for the invitation to present. So given that we have a diverse mix of participants on this webinar, I'm going to provide a broad overview and not go into too much detail. So any specific documents that I referred to, or if you'd like any further information, it's available on the ISDA website. So that's www.isda.org. So the IAM rules for the jurisdictions in the region are broadly similar and consistent with the BCBS-IOSCO guidelines. In general, the rules require the exchange of initial margin and variation margin between covered entities. Covered entities are generally financial entities and systemically important non-financial entities, which are defined by the national regulator. There are exclusions for physically settled FX forwards and swaps, and entities that have OTC derivatives notionals below 8 billion euros are exempted from posting initial margin. There are also exemptions for sovereign entities, multilateral development banks, and transactions with BIS. Now, as for the BCBS guidelines, initial margin requirements will be phased in, starting with those entities that have an average aggregate notional amount, or ANA, of 3 trillion euros or above. For phase 2, the ANA threshold drops to 2.25 trillion euros, followed by 1.5 trillion euros for phase 3, 0.75 trillion euros for phase 4, and finally, at the end of the phase-in period, there will be a minimum ANA of 8 billion euros necessary for covered entities to be subject to initial margin requirements. So the final determinations for whether you're in scope can only be made after the ANA observation window. Now, that's typically between March and May for a September implementation. However, firms will need to conduct estimates long before this observation window in order to have enough time to prepare. Now, do note over here that the national regulators have defined the ANA in the local currency, so there could be a difference in the ANA between jurisdictions. Also, while the EU, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia delayed implementation, that delay applied to phase 1 entities only. So from phase 2 onwards, all jurisdictions are aligned for IAM requirements. Now, apart from determining whether you're in scope, you will also have to make this determination for your counterparties. You could do this in a few ways. One is, essentially call up all of your counterparties, but that would take a very long time. So ISDA has developed what we call a self-disclosure letter, or SDL, which is available electronically on ISDA Amend to assist market participants with the exchange of the necessary information with counterparties to make that determination. So the SDL is modular in structure with country-specific annexes, so you can choose what information to disclose to your counterparties. So to sum it up, the most important activities to determine whether you're in scope and when you're in scope to calculate your ANA or get at least a close approximation for each jurisdiction that you're looking at, as well as to know your counterparty's ANA, and as well as to determine if there are any exemptions.
Okay, I see. So do you expect any kind of other local regulations to be added in the near future?
So for the APAC region, we have a mix of BCBS and non-BCBS jurisdictions. Of the BCBS jurisdictions, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and Korea have issued their final margin rules. India issued draft rules for consultation in May 2016, but have postponed implementation indefinitely until industry concerns are addressed. India has also indicated plans to decouple final VM rules from IAM rules, and therefore they will implement VM first before implementing IAM. China and Indonesia have not indicated any plans to issue final margin rules at this stage. Okay. Now, while the non-BCBS jurisdictions such as Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, do not have their own margin regulations, and nor have they indicated any plans to issue margin regulations. It's important to note here that your counterparties in these regions might be in scope indirectly, and it is important to reach out to them as well.
Okay. Understood. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on now and have a look at, let's have a look at regulatory requirements. And drill into that a bit more. I might move over to you, Sophie. So firms are now starting to get ready for IAM compliance. And I guess from your perspective, what are the key elements of Reg IM and operational preparedness?
Hi, so thank you, Rahul, for the overview of the regulatory framework. And yes, to answer your question, Strath, effectively, there are several elements to work on in order to be compliant. So as a starting point, and we'll drill down into more detailed questions later, I would like to highlight some of the key points to keep in mind from an operational readiness perspective. The first one is the need to discuss and negotiate with counterparties in order to be ready from a legal documentation perspective and specifically to update the CSA agreements. In parallel, discussion with custodians will also be required to prepare for the tri-party settlement. The second thing I would like to highlight is related to the IM calculation, where a system will be needed and selected on time for industry testing. So it's important to keep in mind that that system should be more than a simple margin calculator, as it needs to generate a regulatory compliant margin, which includes regulatory inputs such as multipliers and add-ons. So beyond those two building blocks, once they are ready, every firm will have to plan for industry testing. And so basically, industry testing is another phase in the preparation that needs to be planned for. As a result, we kind of expect probably a timeline of 2 years between the starting point of an implementation and the compliance date.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for that, Sophie. Let's have a little bit more of a drill down now in terms of the phasing, and we've got some quite detailed kind of map here in terms of the phasing. Rahul, so far we've only got 26 firms and their affiliates live on ISDA SIM. What's your view again there on the regarding the next phases?
So the 26 firms, Strat, represent the 20 phase 1 firms and 6 phase 2 firms, and this is globally. We expect around 10 firms to be in scope for phase 3, so that's in 2018. Somewhere between 30 to 50 for phase 4, that's in 2019. And the latest estimates indicate somewhere between 750 to 1,000 firms in phase 5. That's 2020. So this is globally. So you can see that the bulk of the firms are going to be in scope in 2020, and that's simply because the threshold drops drastically to 8 billion notional. Now, it remains to be seen if all of these firms will implement the ISDA SIM, as this determination is firm and portfolio specific. However, I can say that we have already started receiving queries from some phase 5 firms in the region on implementation. And this is because the ISDA SIM offers a few advantages. The first is operational simplicity. Compared with every bank making its own IM model, many banks just don't have the operational capabilities to develop their own models. Banks also don't have to implement all of their counterparties' models in order to check the correctness of margin calls. We have to keep in mind over here that when we're talking about IM, you're looking at calculating two numbers. The first is what you feel you owe your counterparty, and the second number is what you think your counterparty owes you. And your counterparty will make those two calculations as well. Now, if those calculations don't match, you're going to have a dispute. By using a standardized model such as the SIM, you sort of, reduce the number of potential disputes that you can have over here. And you also don't have to implement multiple initial margin models. And finally, there's consistent regulatory governance and oversight, and this is a very important part of the BCBS-IOSCO guidelines. And I think we'll go into some of these in more detail when we discuss the ISDA SIM in the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, so let's thanks, Rahul. Let's drill now more into the technical space and get Namdi involved. So, Namdi, could you give us a high-level overview to start on the SIM methodology?
Yes, I can, Stra. Thank you. So, I believe you can all see the single slide that summarizes what the SIM is all about, essentially all about. I'll just, play out and give some more color around the a number of these points highlighted. So SIM is a sensitivity-based model. It was adapted from the, it's the very heart of it is based on the FRTB sensitivity-based approach. And what it means is that the primary input to it is market risks. Particularly for SIM, you talk about things like delta, vega, and you take that in as opposed to taking in trade details that include things like notional. Now, what that means is that for any trade, irrespective of how complicated it might be, so long as you can determine sensitivities, then you can calculate initial margin using SIM. So that's pretty important. So it has, this feature, taking in market risk as the primary input. And the point is, you want to be able to predict the likely change in the value of your portfolio over 10 business days. Right? That's the key point with the SIM. It's looking at the change in the value of a portfolio over 10 business days. And this 10 business day is specified by the BCBS, particularly the BCBS 317 document. And it's termed the margin period of risk, as some of you may be well aware of. And the whole idea there is that you have a sense of, this is the time it takes for me to close out my exposures. As such, I want to have in place a certain amount that will cushion for the loss I may experience should my counterparty go into default. So that's the argument for the 10 business days. Now, given you are predicting, there's the point to predict with a certain level of confidence. And that certain level of confidence is specifically stated as the 99th percentile level of confidence. Right? And this is also guidelines that is set by the BCBS, particularly in the BCBS 317 document. And that is actually entitled the margin requirements for non-centrally cleared derivatives. Now, what does it actually mean when I talk about this on 99th percentile confidence level? Well, it's essentially a case of, and I'll just quote from the slide, it means that the probability that the initial margin, let's assume that is K, is enough, should be 99% or more. So let's imagine that SIM, it's meant to actually predict for P&L moves or P&L for a portfolio over a 10-day period. If I look historically at, say look at 100 historical observations of P&L, the expectation is SIM covers for those at least 99 times, right? So I don't want to get anything less than 99. I want to get that and above, 99 and above, and that's the idea with the SIM. That's the idea with the confidence level, etc. So just to close off, SIM plays a pretty important role in industry, as Rahul was saying. I am looking with the initial margin space. I will calculate an amount that I expect my counterparty to post, right? So it's pretty important that my counterparty is able to actually replicate that calculation. And the event that they don't agree with it, then, given it's a standard approach, you can find quickly ways to reconcile that difference and agree what it should be such that you meet your regulatory requirements. So I'll pause on that. Thank you, Strat.
Okay. So I think we're all, pretty familiar by now that it's, SIM is a standard kind of parametric VAR. But on top of the VAR calculation piece, then, the margin calculation is also based on regulatory information that we're taking in based on CSA related regulators, and also the regulatory margin add-ons and multipliers. Could you elaborate a little bit on the on this and kind of what your view is that the regulators will start using the add-ons and multipliers for?
Sure, I can. So maybe it's just worth giving you a bit of background. So this add-ons and multipliers that we talk about, they were introduced in the SIM version 1.1, call it SIM 1.1. And that was that became effective, I believe that became effective sometime on the 1st of January 2017. Now,
yes.
The whole idea with the multipliers, particularly, from the view of what the regulator uses for, is, let's imagine a case that I have certain product classes that maybe the regulators may feel, given the time, given the period, given the market conditions, are particularly risky. And in order for them to get some comfort, they might ask firms to include additional IM for specific product classes, right? That's a way to achieve that by using this multipliers.
Dial it up.
Now, yes, to just cushion it up. I mean, this can also be used on a bilateral basis, because let's imagine there are instances where counterparties feel that the SIM is not, it needs an extra amount. Maybe there are SIM shortfalls they observe in their test, very unlikely, but needs an extra amount. And as such, they may agree to introduce extra IM for certain product classes, or even extra IM across the whole product classes. So they can use this functionality of the notional-based add-ons or the multipliers directed towards particular product classes in order to introduce extra IM. Now, there is a second way that the regulators could use these add-ons, and it's in the case where, a second instance. It's in a case where a regulator feels that the counterparty you may be exposed to may possibly more counterparty credit risk than can be observed, right? In such an instance, the regulators may ask you to introduce or to ask for more IM in order to cushion you in the case of, default of your counterparty, for example. So, I mean, if you want to go more into details, obviously you know that there is the SIM 2.0 methodology document, but particularly around this, add-ons and multipliers, you find that on the page 28 entitled Annex A, Additional Initial Formulas. And what you see clearly with the structure is that with the notional-based add-ons, it's essentially looking across all product classes. In a way, you can imagine it that way. But with the products, with the multiplier, it's used to target specific product classes. So one looks across all product classes, one looks particularly at specific product classes. But I'll pause there.
Okay. No, that's really good. Thanks very much for that. So moving, next into the process, what are the requirements around backtesting and the methodology?
Sorry, Shah, was that meant for me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. So if you are referring to the ISDA backtesting approach, well, ISDA, we adopt this 1+3 style approach, and in terms of the 1+3 style approach, what you are looking to do is, I guess, is the key thing is, what does 1 mean? What does the 3 mean? So the ISDA 1+3, essentially looking at, you need to incorporate 1 year stress period. And this is generally determined from the calibration of the SIM, right? And then you also look at the 3-year period, which is the most recent period from a given portfolio reference date. So let's imagine I have a portfolio and I want to check that the SIM I calculated on a particular end of quarter is actually sufficient and is doing what it should do. Well, what I would do is I would freeze that portfolio on a particular reference date, calculate the SIM on that reference date, and then look historically, 3 years recent period from that reference date, but also identify the 1 year stress period historically, i.e. this is the most volatile 1 year period that I can find historically, right? I pull that up together for the observations, probably about 1,040 in the 1+3 period. I will determine the relevant P&L vectors over this 1+3 period. And once I get that, possibly using variance, for example, but once I get that, I want to compare those P&L vectors with SIM, right? And the expectation is that SIM is at least equal to generally greater than all these P&L vectors over the historical period, right? And it comes back to the point of, you're looking at 99 percentile coverage. So you factor that in, and the outputs of these, this is the style back test. It's essentially two things. One is a color, derived from the Basel traffic light test. So you get a red, amber, or green to actually indicate the performance of SIM, right? Red obviously is not good. Amber is, okay, not sure if it's bad or good. Green is, which is what we typically get, saying it's good and it's doing its job as it should. But then from generally when you get the red or amber, then you want to quantify the severity of the poor performance, right? And then you arrive at the figure called the shortfall. And this is a measure of, it's just a quantification of how well SIM may not be performing should you get a red or amber from your test.
Okay.
So two things, the Basel traffic light test and the shortfall is the output of this is the 1+3 style back test, which I've just described now.
Okay. Yeah, we've encountered that a couple, quite familiar with that now on our implementations through Japan. So also, Namdi, can I get you to describe the SIM governance framework and what you think it will change for firms?
Sure. So yeah, let me take the first part. So describing the SIM governance framework. So the framework essentially sets out, the principles under which SIM would operate and the process through which it will be reviewed and amended on a consistent and transparent basis. That is the purpose of the framework, right? It focuses particularly, on development of the SIM, governance and development of the SIM in coordination with SIM users and also regulators. And it also gives, overarching guidance on, to firms while they do their firm level portfolio monitoring, where they check the adequacy of the SIM coverage with their counterparty, and then gives you, a process in place of how you escalate issues to ISDA. Now, one thing I need to highlight, and it's pretty important, is at the heart of this framework, there are a number of key processes, that need to work in order to support what we call the evidence-based approach to the SIM governance. Now, there are three key ones that I list and describe in a bit more detail. Now, there's the SIM quarterly monitoring exercise, and this is a case where you are looking at the performance of the current effective version of SIM. So, for example, right now we have SIM 2.0, and what firms will do on a quarterly basis is they perform certain tests, one of which is the ISDA 1+3 back test, which I just described, in order to assess the performance of SIM for their portfolios, right? All of this, for these monitored portfolios, the data is submitted to ISDA, and I, would responsible for doing the analysis, first of all, the aggregation, the analysis, and then the anonymization of that data when I do the reports that are shared both with the SIM users and also eventually to the regulators. So that's a key part of the exercise to assess how well SIM is performing, and this is done on a quarterly basis. Now, from this exercise, you derive evidence of, SIM doing well, is it doing not so well? If it is not doing so well, the question is, are these material issues? So the forum, this is the governance forum, comprises of SIM users and potential SIM users, will come together to assess on three criteria. Are the issues that we see persistent, i.e. do you see them on successive quarters of monitoring? Secondly, are the issues we see material? And thirdly, how widespread are these issues? Is it just affecting one firm, or is it like, quite a significant portion of the industry? So based on these three criteria, you review through this lens and decide upon action, whether action needs to be taken, action that would have material impact, to the SIM users and also the SIM and the operational benefits, etc., that it could provide. So that's one key aspect, and that's the lens we view things, when they decide to make changes. Now, once you decide you want to make changes, there's a case of actually, what do these changes mean? Is it a case of, merely just updating parameters? Is it a case of possibly introducing new risk factors, for example, or making certain risk factors more granular, right? In those cases, you then need to talk about recalibration. So you want to update the parameters either for the existing risk factors, but also for new risk factors that you may introduce in light of evidence about SIM's performance. So you talk about the recalibration exercise, and the annual recalibration exercise will use data that also incorporates a period of financial stress to derive parameters that meet the 99th percentile confidence for this 10-day margin period of risk, which you've described earlier. And these results are reviewed. And then there is obviously the third part of this. Once you recalibrate it, then you want to ensure that the recalibrated parameters, recalibrated SIM is performing as it should. And then you bring in the whole exercise of back testing again, and this is the annual back testing, but also the benchmarking exercise, and which is where you look at observable standards for IM calculations, and then you compare that to SIM. So you need to look at products that can be cleared, but also traded OTC. And for such products, you then determine what the IM is from the CCP, but also compare that with the SIM IM or IM calculated using the SIM methodology. So those three processes, the quarterly monitoring, the recalibration, back testing, and benchmarking are key for the governance. And the point is, because firms are, already performing these processes and also feeding into it, they can leverage the results that come out of it for their, firm level governance, whether it be, looking towards model validation, for example, but also in their meetings with regulators, right? So there's an encouragement to participate, because essentially leveraging your existing processes, but also you can take the information, and the information is now you're not just looking from a firm level point of view, you're looking across the industry. So this is showing SIM is working as it should, and it's working as it should for the industry. It's also working as it should for me when you go through your firm level governance process. So there is a benefit there, and this is how things can, change for firms going forward. It's not just looking purely at the firm level, but now you have industry insight as well on the performance of the SIM.
Okay.
Trusted more.
Okay, so I might jump back across to Sophie. So Sophie, for the firms using SIM, they'll need to establish their inputs to the SIM calculation, as kind of just heard. So what's your recommendation to firms who are starting to make these preparations?
Yes, that's an important point, and Namdi has actually spoken a lot about the back testing and the accuracy of the margin. Obviously, the margin cannot be correct if the input to the margin calculation is not correct. So taking a step back, as you know, the inputs for the SIM calculation are Greek sensitivities. And they are very well defined in the ISDA white paper named Risk Data Standards. And as Rahul mentioned earlier, all those documents are available on the ISDA website. So basically, there is a best practice that is defined, and every firm needs to generate risk inputs consistent with the rest of the industry. Otherwise, they will have to manage endless disputes. Effectively, the SIM risk factors, they will not only be used for margin calculation, but once the margin is generated, then we'll need to be able to access those for disputes for validation for drill down. Recalculation on the fly will also be needed. Very often, drill down will have to be done at the trade level, at the risk factor level. So a lot of flexibility will be needed. Not only the risk factor calculation generation, but in the way those numbers are being stored and available for the end users. So what we have seen with our current clients in Japan, in Australia, that phase 1, 2, and 3 firms and players, they've actually selected front office and risk solutions to generate the risk inputs for SIM calculation. And the recommendation we have is actually for the phase 4 and 5 to use similar standards in terms of systems for the input calculation for the ISTA-SIM model.
Okay. And I think, you know, just kind of moving on from that as well, I think it follows on well. I mean, some of your clients that we've been working with have been involved in reconciling, you know, CRIF files that we work with. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and some of the issues that have cropped up during the testing, specifically around, you know, dispute resolution?
Yes. So just because we have a wide audience, as a reminder, CRIF means Common Risk Interchange Format, and the CRIF file is one of the ISTA-SIM market standard formats to be used to calculate initial margin. So this being said, while the format is standard and there are very good white papers documenting the risk definition, we've seen a lot of discussion and dispute happening. This is why we are recommending to start the process sooner as opposed to later. Because during the early stages of reconciliation, there are many discussions at every step in those risk calculation. It starts with the curve generation, with how the per rate pillars would be defined. Should we do valuation as of T-1, as of T? And then it can be more involved when we go into structured products, which could be exploded by legs, or some of the risk factors like the cross-currency basis risk, which are maybe more complicated, and there are many discussions between counterparties to validate and discuss those points, right? So this is why industry testing is so important, because in those early stages, every firm will select a couple of friendly counterparties and go into details of the reconciliation of those risk factors for very complicated portfolios. It's a way to battle test the solution, basically. And in summary, again, back to the earlier point, it's very important to have a system that has the full decomposition and the full granularity, so that you have all the tools you need to do your reconciliation during industry testing and once you are compliant, obviously.
Okay. Good. All right. So look, let's move on from here into getting ready. I think we've talked a fair bit about inputs. We've talked about the governance framework now. We've talked about reconciliation of those risk inputs and dispute resolution. Let's have a look at getting ready. So there's a number of kind of key steps here, and I think they can actually run in parallel. I don't think they're actually chronological. But Rahul, do you want to jump in here and maybe have a comment on here, share some of ISDA's kind of suggested steps?
Sure, Strath. And I think, you know, Sophie covered some of these when she talked about the regulatory requirements on slide 4. But ISDA has prepared a fact sheet that firms should consider when preparing to comply with the regulatory initial margin requirements. Now, this fact sheet is on the ISDA website, and it's been designed for firms to distribute internally as well as to your counterparties. And we have also shared this fact sheet with regulators in the region. The steps are up there on the slide, but I'll just go through these in brief. So the first step is to identify your in-scope entities early. And as I mentioned previously, you need to identify counterparties that are estimated to have an ANA of non-clear derivatives that exceeds the level for the relevant future phases and dates. So as a recap, for phase 4, which is September 2019, the threshold is 750 billion euros. For phase 5, which is September 2020, it's 8 billion euros, or similar amounts in other currencies, depending on the applicable local regulations. The second step is to make early disclosures to your counterparties, and firms should disclose the status of estimated in-scope entities to counterparties in order to prepare them and provide enough time to complete all of the steps with each party. And from past experience, we sort of note that disclosure will need to occur at least 12 to 18 months before the IM go live date. So for example, if you expect to go live in September 2020, you should be looking at, you know, making your disclosures to counterparties somewhere around March of 2019. you need that much lead time in order to get all the steps in place. The third step is to exchange information on compliance. So, for example, which custodians will you and your counterparties use to post IAM? How will you and your counterparties calculate IAM? So, for example, are you using the ISDA SIM? Are you using standardized tables? Are you using some other method? You'll also have to determine the minimum transfer amounts, or MTAs, as well as the initial margin thresholds. The fourth step is to identify special cases. So some things to consider here are to include the impact of non-netting jurisdictions. Each jurisdiction has separate sort of regulations for non-netting, for treatment of non-netting jurisdictions. You'll need to look at your local stamp duty or any other collateral perfection charges. You'll also need to consider whether you have legal opinion coverage for compliance with the regulations in each jurisdiction. Step 5 is to establish your custodial relationships. So you need to establish relationships with the relevant custodians, as well as provide information on all of your in-scope counterparty relationships. And it's very important to note here that this process could take months, depending on the custodian's KYC requirements. Step 6 is to prepare for compliance. So, build up the necessary capacity for compliance in advance. So this includes, as Namdi mentioned, preparing your IAM calculation methodology, as well as any operational capacity as necessary. And this includes any of your IT or your system builds. And as you all know, this takes a lot of lead time as well. Step 7 is to negotiate and execute your documentation. So this includes your bilateral IAM CSAs or collateral transfer agreements or security agreements for each counterparty pair, a trilateral account control agreement or similar documentation for your counterparty custodian trio, as well as an ISDA SIM license agreement and ISDA SIM crowdsourcing utility participation agreement if needed. And finally is, finalizing your preparations. So ensure that all of your necessary relationships are up and running, everything's been tested, and you're ready to go live. Now, Strat, as you mentioned, these are not necessarily presented in chronological order. The precise order and timing will depend on a firm's specific circumstances, and some processes will have to work in parallel. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think from what I've seen, step 7 should not be underestimated. I think the size and complexity of working through those new agreements with your counterparties. Okay, so look, let's move on to what the solution looks like. Sophie, what from your perspective, the solution should first be looking for in terms of being fully compliant?
So basically the slide we have here, it's a summary of everything we've discussed so far, right? So basically all those pieces we've talked about, all those requirements can be grouped into 4 components. Firms will need a tool to compute risk factors using the market best practice valuation approach. They will need a margin calculator that is using ISDA SIM methodology and supporting regulator enrichment, and also regulator add-on and multiplier. They will need a very strong post-processing collateral solution that supports MTA, wrongful risk, two-way settlement, and tri-party settlement services to meet all the new regulation. And then overall, they will need a regulatory compliant solution. And beyond this vertical integration that is really needed, firms should also think beyond compliance, because the daily process of generating this new initial margin and the dispute management will actually create new costs. It will create operational costs, and it will also create a cost for every transaction. So basically, to stay profitable, every firm has to think in terms of what-if simulation, collateral optimization, and eventually MVA calculation. Right? So in summary, this is the feedback we would have is think beyond compliance. And try to stay profitable by selecting the optimal solution for you to optimize all your costs. And then on that note, since you've been implementing ISDA SIM and bilateral margin with quite a few clients in APAC, could you share some best practice and recommendation in terms of implementation?
Yeah, sure. I think from our perspective, we've had the privilege now to have done it enough that we've really been able to kind of standardise our approach from a professional services perspective, and we've kind of broken that out into kind of six key phases of our framework. Initially, what we have is we come on site for what is more like a sim boot camp, where we have a standardised training module. And can really, get involved and bring both the client business team and also, the project team up to speed. And that's, both working with collateral users, with risk users, with quants. There's a lot of people that need to come up to speed on the module, and they do so quickly. The second phase is really what we call blueprint. So we do, even though we've got a standard, solution here at Calypso already, then, we still sit down and do an analysis and design phase. And this is particularly, important when you want to work out where your risk sensitivities are going to be coming from, how you're going to be integrating them into Calypso, what's going to be going downstream to your, potentially down to your collateral system, and kind of, documenting those requirements up front. The foundation, is our next phase. As we've been implementing this, we now have, a toolkit of standardized configuration packages that we can use to expedite. So we bring that configuration with us for the Calypso package. And then the next one is really execution. So based on, any additional specific config, whether it be static data, curve configuration, integration to upstream systems, any specific reporting that needs to be set up, that's the next phase that we move into. Now, what we've seen is that's relatively, relatively short. The bigger phases that we see is really the validation phase, and that's really because a lot of it is on the testing side. So, we have what we've done is for the internal testing, we've created a standardized testing Excel package, which works with standard ISDA test case scenarios that we can run through the model and validate against a base set of results, so you get comfort there. That works well with the quants as well. Counterparty testing, so we then support the business actually running IAM with friendly counterparties, and reconciling through Acadia. And then as you move on into industry-wide testing, as we kind of discussed earlier, then that you need to be looking towards, much more formal documentation of your results, and getting prepared for sign-off with the regulators. So again, backtesting, Calypso comes with an existing backtesting framework that we can leverage there, allowing for historical validation that we discussed across the 1+3. And I guess, one of the biggest components where we really do help the clients now is around getting their regulator, sign off. And that's a really important piece that you want to do as early as possible. We've been through this process now with phase 2 clients. We've been through it with phase 3 clients across different jurisdictions. So we've worked in terms of sign off for JFSA, with the Fed Reserve, with APRA, so we've got, the structure and the documents there to help, help the business really prepare for that. Okay.
Thank you,
So hopefully that covers off.
Yeah.
Hopefully that covers off that. I think let's move on to what's next. Okay. Sophie, do you want to kind of wrap up here and summarize next steps for compliance and beyond?
Sure. So given everything we've just discussed, it will take time and effort to be compliant. And beyond compliance, there is a need to think about costs and ways to optimize those costs, right? So we have to keep in mind the direct cost, as now every OTC derivative cleared or uncleared will generate IM funding costs. And then in addition, there will be operational costs because there is a new need to calculate initial margin, to process it, to manage disputes. So in summary, for all the firms before the compliance date, they need to check all the compliance boxes for sure, but they also need to keep in mind the cost optimization, because this new regulation that most firms have to comply with can be very costly. Fortunately, there are ways to actually optimize the cost and still stay profitable. So that would be the final recommendation.
Okay. Good. Rahul, is there anything you wanted to add before I move on to some questions? We've got some questions coming through on the webinar, so I did want to try and get to those.
Sure. I guess just to wrap up, I think based on our experience, we've seen that negotiating and executing documentation, as well as establishing custodial relationships, take the most time. So it's important for firms to consider starting these processes early. And in addition, you'll also need to start looking at SIM implementation as early as possible, especially if you require regulatory approval. So, just to reiterate, it's absolutely imperative to start preparing for your IAM requirements as soon as possible. And just some information. So ISA published a Future of Derivatives survey in April 2018 to consider the issues facing the industry in order to gauge how the derivatives market will develop and evolve. And when asked, how would you characterize the industry's readiness for the next phases of regulatory initial margin rollout, only 4.8% of respondents stated that they are well progressed. 25.2% responded that there is some progress, but they are on track, while the majority, which is 49.1%, stated that there is some progress, but they are behind schedule. 8.4% responded to say there's little to no progress, while 12.5% did not know. So to put that in perspective, that's about 70% of respondents stated that there is some progress, but they're behind schedule, or that there is little to no progress, or they did not know. And in my books, if you don't know, then that probably means that you're behind schedule. So only 30% of respondents are on track for this date. We also published a new margin survey in April again this year, which shows that IAM collected by the top 20 firms increased by 22% to 130.6 billion at the end of 2017, compared with 107.1 billion at the end of March 2017. So, if you're looking beyond 2020, another thing to keep in mind is what these changes have meant for the market. These numbers are only going to increase as more firms come into scope, and it's important to firms to start looking at collateral management and collateral optimization processes going forward as well.
Okay, thank you. Some staggering figures in there, but hopefully, those numbers start to change. Okay, so we're going to skip the polling and move to questions. I'm just looking here, and then I'm going to allocate them out. So the first one is, look, for IM, physically settled FX swaps and forwards are excluded. So does that mean it has a different product scope with VM? Maybe Sophie or...
Maybe Namdi, want to take this one?
Namdi?
Oh, no, Sophie, are you happy to take that? I think.
I can take that, actually. So for FX products, for most of the jurisdictions, physically settled FX forwards and swaps are not subject to the requirements, but they are part of your ANA calculation. So when you look at whether you're, crossing the threshold, you will need to factor in those products for your calculations. For some of the jurisdictions, IM also does not apply to the exchange of principal under cross-currency swaps. So that's for most jurisdictions. So essentially, if you're looking at physically settled FX forwards and swaps, they are not subject to any of the IM requirements. However, you will need to include them in your ANA calculations.
Okay. I'll jump down here to backtesting P&L process. So this one I'll flick to you, Sophie. So on the backtesting P&L process, are the PL measures required for this process supported by Calypso, or is some custom work required?
So yes, we have a solution out of the box, and we have phase 1 clients that are already using it. So basically, backtesting is very similar to what people were using for the CCP Calypso claiming solution. So for us, it was just a simple extension to get that to work for assessing backtesting.
Straight out of the box.
Yeah.
Okay. Another one here. So Rahul or Namdi, you might be able to pick this one up. On the 10 business day closeout, given the stay protocol in certain jurisdictions, does it mean that the closeout period could be more than 10 days then?
I mean, it's possible. So I think one thing you want to try and distinguish between is, as part of the regulations, the margin period of risk is 10 days. That's an assumption that is firmly fixed by the regulators. Now, in practice, so if I'm a firm that has a really big position, it might take me longer than 10 days to rehedge that position should my counterparty go into default, right? And for the larger positions like that, within SIM, there is the methodology recognizes that, and you talk about things like concentration thresholds or concentration risk. And for large positions like that, you're expected to call for more IM, because that means you're saying that as a firm, I'm exposed to this risk for longer, than I would not be expected to. As such, I want to hold more IM to compensate me for you going into default. Such that if the portfolio value moves out, something to cushion that loss. So so the two things, margin period rate is fixed by the regulators and it's 10 business days, but in practice, firms may take longer to offload or rehedge that position. And that is factored into the IM calculation within SIM.
Okay. And one more before we wrap up here, I think, if add-on is requested by regulators, does it mean that the counterparty will need to agree to post extra IM amount?
Strabo, that's directed to me.
Oh, whoever can pick that one up.
I mean, because I don't particularly have insight to, the firms and, them being instructed by the regulators. So I wonder if there's anybody that has more specific insight into that. Okay.
Strath, can you just repeat just to make sure I have it entirely, and then I'll answer?
Sure. So if add-on is requested by the regulators, does it mean that the counterparty will need to agree to post the extra IM amount?
Okay, so the first thing is that as of now, the add-on and the multipliers, they are theoretical, meaning no regulator has implemented any of those, right? So it's all theoretical, meaning we don't really have any practice on how the validation will be done. But I would expect that every single number in the margin calculation is validated at once, including add-on and additional margin. But again, this is theoretical because we are still waiting for one regulator, and it might be the US one, to actually start using those multipliers and add-ons.
Okay, well, look, we'll close there. Thank you very much, Namdi, and also thank you, Sophie and Rahul, for taking the time today for the full hour. And also thanks very much to the webinar audience for attending. Look, we'll make this recording available shortly, and it'll be sent to all the attendees once it's ready. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at marketing@calypso.com. Have a great day, and thank you. Bye.